Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the Program Associate at YIVO. Today, we are hosting a screening of Epitaph for a Centaur 6 years later, which is a film about the poems of Joseph Brodsky. The screening will be followed by a discussion with our esteemed panelists, and I would like to thank our co-sponsors, Poetry in America and COJECO, for co-sponsoring today's event. For those of you who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. Our library and archive contains over 24 million documents and 400,000 books, which are used by researchers from all around the world. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, and public programs just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast archival and library collections. So thank you for joining us this evening, and please stay tuned for the panel discussion after the film.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I'm the director and creator of that film, and I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be here with my colleagues on this stage. I just wanted to say just a few words before I turn most of this over to the rest of the panel, and I'll just try to prompt them with questions that allow them to share their much deeper knowledge of Joseph Brodsky and Russian culture than I have. But let me just say that my goal in making this film was to introduce Brodsky to a broad and general public that watches the television series Poetry in America. So this is an audience that is curious about poetry, has stereotypes about what American poetry is in mind, thinks it's Robert Frost, Maya Angelou, and my goal and my great opportunity in making this television series is to bring great poets like Joseph Brodsky to much broader attention. So it's in that context, not as the ultimate statement for sure on Joseph Brodsky or what he should mean to any of us, that I made this film. I'll say one more thing about that to sort of move me into a question to the panel. When one makes a film that's 24 minutes long about a complicated person, an extraordinarily complicated 20th century history, a poet who writes in a language one doesn't speak, there's a story that needs to be told. And in the story that I was trying to tell, central, because I was so persuaded by Ann, Joseph's literary executor, and because I could see it in the work itself, my central goal had to be share the poetry, help an audience understand what was extraordinary, help them see the brilliance of Brodsky as a craftsman and as a student of culture, and also help them see Brodsky as a poet commenting sometimes on his times and on his own life. And so Brodsky as an artist, Brodsky as an American, Brodsky as a Soviet, as a child born in the Soviet Union, Brodsky as an artist who worked also in a visual medium. You've noticed, of course, how many of Brodsky's own illustrations were part of this film. So it was my job to balance all of these elements, but it's the job of this panel to to, I hope, and all of you, some of you, as we turn to the Q&A, to highlight particular elements of this constellation, and to enrich what I was only able to introduce in a 24-minute film. And so, it's not easy to hold a mic and hold a few little notes at the same time. In that spirit, I'd actually love to ask Ann, Regina, and Jonathan, in whatever way and at whatever moment that you were watching this film, that you first thought, I wish that there'd been more of this, or how could she have left out that, or the point really was that, or another film ought to be made in this spirit. And I'd like, Regina, maybe to ask you first if you would be willing to speak about that.
Okay. I have to thank you because the film is absolutely great. And extremely interesting and very serious, actually. And the conversation about poetry is on the very, very high level. Because what I wanted to talk more about the young Brodsky and the perception of his poetry by young people like I was at that time. But what
That's
is
just
interesting,
what we want to hear.
What was extremely interesting for me, that in this film I saw like a different Brodsky would say, because we remember our perception of him and his poetry when he was young. There were like a few photographs, and when he was like a crazy man, going around the Leningrad, different places, and his beautiful poetry, which we really adore. So this was really very important for us, because what was important for us, that we immediately recognized that he would be a pinnacle of the whole poetry process of the 50s and 60s. We accepted him as a king, of the poetry, really. He came like, what I can say, like the last echelon, after the Moscow Pleiad. And we liked these poets a lot, but he came after, and he was much deeper, and he was much more related to us. And his apolitical poetry, it was exactly how we lived, because we were staying out of politics. Otherwise, you have to be with them or against them. And it was both sides were very bad. So we were artists, and I was a student of the Academy of Art at this time. We were trying not to participate, not to be there. And because of that, his poetry, it was like self-identification for the generation, for all of us. It was a tune for our authenticity of being. He allowed us to be this way, because
can I just ask, what does that? I mean, because he wrote about love, because he wrote why was that?
Yeah, he wrote about love, and he wrote about existence of a person in this environment. How you can live, how you can feel, how you can see things around you. This was very important. And yes, it was about love. And for us, it was also very important because we were like very young people. We were interested in all these experiences, of love and feelings and the relationship and so on. But also it was about literature, about art, and about, what he was always what was equal for him. Like you remember in one poetry, he said that там были места, где припадал устами к кустам и пером к кустам. So there were places where you like push, lips to lips and the pen to the paper. And it was absolutely the same thing for him, What also his tragic love would say with Marina, it was not so tragic. It's basically, she betrayed him at once with his friend Bobyshev. And there are like many, stories about this. But finally, he left her because when she got a child, he could not stand there. They were so absolutely out of real world, both of them. She was the artist, he was the poet. And of course, he could not sustain his wife and his child in any way. You know that he didn't graduate even from the 8th grade in the school.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second to make sure I understand. I mean, it sounds like you're saying the normality of being just an adolescent or, a young person, the excitement of just also thinking about him as a romantic, dashing figure was rewarding for all of you.
Yes, he was, but he was a romantic figure. He was I would say, our hero maybe, We really like his poetry. We like his poetry to such extent that I was mesmerizing, memorizing all of them, and it was like a part of our life. At the same time, it was a reality, and because I used to meet him not closely, but through, for example, Efim Etkind, who was his defender, this literary professor, who was his defender at the trial. We were neighbors in our dacha in Ushkova, in Karelia, and I met him a few times. Also, it was one episode in my life. I was a student at the academy, as I said, and he just came back from exile. And I was approached by one woman at the academy, and she said to me, Regina, let's do his poetry reading. And I said, oh, yeah, of course, yeah. And I talked to my dean, and my dean said, I'm not sure. So we understood this very well. And what I wanted to tell you that we were trying to stay out of politics as much as possible. But this episode shows that it was not possible to get out at all, forever. So in a few days, like weeks later, there was a meeting in our course. And it was very small because we were art historians. And it was like 6-7 girls, and it was one boy. And something happened, and they told, yeah, we have to vote for like, like consort, is there some formalities that we didn't really pay attention. And we want to vote for Regina because she's a good student, blah, blah, blah. And there was one guy who said, no, I can't vote for Regina because she wanted to invite a convicted criminal, Brodsky. And everybody was like shocked, because of this. It was like, oh my God, we want to not to be there, but it came to us. And when it was finished, my dean came to me and told me, Regina, I apologize. You know, I was shocked as you, but you will go to Germany soon to the student trip. We have an exchange with Humboldt, and this guy will never go anywhere. So what I want to tell, that there were like bad people, but also were nice people. And among nice people, there were these defenders of Brodsky at the trial, and who helped them later on. So, you know.
Thank you so much for telling that story.
It's like environment, you know.
And you were young too when you met Brodsky. Wholly different situation.
Yes, well, I would say that he had the effect on me probably that he had on many Americans when he arrived as an emigre from the Soviet Union, because in Russia, the act of reading poetry together, the act of writing it, of being part of a world of poetry, was a very vital way of maintaining the spiritual life of regular people. And it was sort of infused through this kind of secret world of unofficial vitality. And when Joseph came to America, he was frustrated and irritated that poetry had kind of been corralled into these elite environs and was seen as a kind of erudite occupation. In fact, I wanted to say that he would have been so enthusiastic about this project. I mean, I think maybe everyone in this audience knows that this is just one installment of many, many seasons of documentaries about all different kinds of poets looking closely into poetry with these interviews with Lisa. Joseph was super enthusiastic about trying, once he got to America, to break poetry out of these academic enclaves. And when he became the Poet Laureate of the United States, he proposed that volumes of poetry be put in every hotel room alongside the Bible, and that they should be put in train stations. And he tried to do PBS documentaries about poems, too. So this is entirely up his alley. But I think a lot of us felt this incredible excitement around this kind of popular urgency around poetry that was broken out of elites. And you know, Joseph himself did not have a higher education. He hung around with these poets like Derek Walcott and Seamus Heaney, who were kind of country boys who hadn't come out of elite environments. And it really gave all of us a new feeling of literary life that was sort of vital and accessible and human.
In preparing a little bit for today, I went back and looked at the interview I did with you, Ann, and the interview I did with you, Jonathan, regretting, of course, all the good things that that I cut. And one of those things that you talked about, Ann, was the sort of higher calling, the really spiritual importance of poetry, yes, for Joseph Brodsky, but also for Russians, and that the way that tradition, and I think we just heard it from Regina as well. I mean, that's almost unimaginable in an American context, a world where one would channel one's emotional life, one's wishes and hopes and dreams into passion for poetry. And yeah, I can understand why he was sad.
He has this very powerful argument in an essay on translating Mandelstam's poetry into English and the importance of preserving form. You know, he argued that this attachment to form that lived on in the Russian poets of the Soviet times was a way of being elevated, of connecting themselves with the higher spiritual values of the generations that had come before, and that if you threw that away, you were just leaving behind all of the powers and the energies that that poetry had to bring into the present. And this was very energizing for us in America because these forms had come to be seen as sort of outdated and sterile and kind of without contemporary urgency. And he really revitalized them for a new generation, and I think we can still see that in a lot of contemporary American writing.
Jonathan, there's so much I cut out of what you what you had said.
Well, I want to come back to your original question, if
Please.
it's okay.
Yeah.
What I might have liked to have seen more of in the film?
Yes, please.
In a way, the film, it seems to me, concentrates on two things. One is his use of language, which, of course, for Brodsky was the quintessential value
I get a check mark on that one.
of the poet.
Yeah.
The other was his use of Roman, Greek mythology, and his larger horizon.
Yeah.
What I wish it could have been included a bit more was the absolute quotidian, pedestrian element that he brought into that, which I believe is so important and makes his work essentially anti-Soviet. Because that was the one thing the Soviets could not, well, there were two things. They could not tolerate the bourgeois ego, which we could define.
Well, why don't you define it here?
Well, I would rather get to the second part
Okay,
first.
all right. I might take you back, though.
Next, which is that day by day things happen that are not planned, that are not heroic, that are ordinary. And if you read Brodsky's poetry, you see that, for instance, when he writes about Zhukov, the great marshal who saved Russia, Soviet Union in World War II, he writes about the most ordinary things. He writes about time passing in this moment-by-moment way. And you see, that was the one thing the Soviets couldn't control. They couldn't control that moment by moment.
How it feels really to live one's life. That was what Regina was saying too.
That was the great enemy. That moment by moment, because if you read the aesthetics, quote unquote, theoretical statements of Russian Soviet critics, they will say things like, poetry is hope. What is hope? Hope is the belief in the progress of the Soviet state, of which each of you is a hero, because each of you is going to sacrifice your last drop of energy for creating the Soviet state. It has nothing to do with the water that's dripping all by itself in the background. But the water that's dripping all by itself in the background is eventually going to bring that down.
Right.
It's brought down by the quotidian. And so, therefore, to me, I think he creates a body of poetry in which he links these two worlds. The mythic world, the world that is built out of care for the word, and also this ordinary experience, the ordinary pleasure, the ordinary feeling that people genuinely have in their lives.
Absolutely. The way they notice how it feels when someone's eyelashes flutter against your palm. I think I got the quotidian in there.
Yeah, you did.
But
that's a poeticized.
You're right. So I'm going to give you a chance to talk about some of the other quotidian that I, in a long, very witty soliloquy that, alas, had to be had to be cut. You also talked about humor and about how Brodsky's humor was the enemy of Soviet ideology. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. Is humor quotidian? Where does humor come from?
Anything that could be, anything that was not controllable became the enemy.
And humor.
Yeah, and that kind of boisterous humor was, they couldn't figure out, for instance, whether this great novel by Yuri Alyosha, Envy, was pro-Soviet or anti-Soviet. Sometimes they would throw him, they would ban it, and sometimes they would not, because they weren't sure what this humor in the novel was really all about, you know. But you can't, anything that could not be controlled.
Yeah.
By that ideological power.
And what about Brodsky as a Jew? I mean, I let Zach Ishoff's One and Brodsky was a Jew say as much as it could. What and where? How do we weigh that?
Yeah, in your movie, he is a alien, you know, alien would say.
Oh,
like,
I want to know what
like
Ann thinks of that.
He's very serious universalism. You know, so in your film, probably this is because you know him in America, yes? I met him in America one time, very briefly at the opening of the Great Utopia at the Guggenheim in 22, and next soon he died. So it's a very different image, you know. Nobel Laureate, American poet, professor, liberal professor. He didn't like actually these liberal professors, but by the way, he was. And somebody who was in Russia, it was different, and in the circle of his friends. And he was definitely Jewish. He was saying about himself, "I'm a bad Jew," probably because he didn't follow, you know, all these rules and so on. But I'm more Jewish than anyone else, because because his nature was very Jewish.
What does
you know, and he said that, for example, the craft that I'm doing make you a Jew. And Jewishness, it's like a consequences of my craft. So if you are the
Jewishness is a consequence of my craft?
Of doing what I'm doing, like doing literature, doing poetry.
Because I become an exile, I become an outsider?
It's not about exile. It's about that if you are a writer, so this connects you with the Bible, with the book. He, of course, was extremely educated. He didn't go to school, so he had a lot of time to read books. And he did read a lot. You know, it's what he said, that the person is what the person reads, you know. Or maybe the bigger crime is not to put books on fire, but not to read them, you know. So this is, and I think it's always like with humor, with irony, and this is very Jewish also features. Also, he had a Jewish accent. And it was a big problem when he was a young man. So his mother, she took him to the doctor to fix it. He visited once the doctor, and he refused to go back. And he actually makes this accent, and he actually this burr R, you know, R, which really shows him as a Jewish person. He made it into his personality, into his reading. he always said that even by the phone, on the phone, I could be recognized as a Jew because of his voice. He had a Jewish voice and Jewish accent. And finally, he included his accent in Рождественский romance, in what it calls in English, Christmas romance from 61, when he said like a Jewish accent on the staircase, on the yellow staircase. You know, I didn't find like a good translation for this, but it was like very, very Mandelштamian. So he featured his own accent, like Jewish accent, in his poem. So this is the way how he inserted
And
himself.
do you think his style of recitation was cantorial?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. He was reading his poetry by swaying, like praying. You know, it was all also very Jewish way. He had such a humor, unbelievable humor, and he made a lot of fun of his Jewishness as well. It's like you know, the Jewish anecdotes, because Jews like to laugh, you know, about themselves, yes? So this is what he did. And his attitude to Israel was the same. So for him, Israel was a provincial country. He didn't know much about what Israel was about. So
He didn't want to go.
He didn't want, yeah, because for him it was a provincial. He called it Israelovka, you know, and he had many words for Israel and for Jewish people, because when he came to New York, he said, "Oh my God, it's even more Jews in there," you know. So these Jewish jokes or jokes on Jewish theme were constantly, you know, there were so many, especially in the circle of friends. Even his dedication to Baryshnikov, one of this was, I'm Aid and you are Goy, you know, we have a different like profile, whatever. So he was playing with this. He was playing with his Jewishness. And of course he was Jewish. And he said, I'm more Jewish than anyone else in this, you know, earth. It's interesting. And maybe you remember his poem, which called Presentation, when he made like verses of Russian expressions, like, you know, and he said there, like, it was all on humor. And he said, in Russian it sounds like, «Над арабской мирной хатой гордо реет жид пархатый». So it means that over Arab peaceful hut, there is like a flying Jew, you know, in the plane, and something like that. Yeah, and I actually like it because in his first Jewish poetry, Jewish cemetery, you know, he was like very much after Boris Slutsky, who was a very important poet. And actually, Slutsky brought like everyday language and everyday matter into the poetry. He totally changed the intonation of Russian poetry. And Brodsky valued him very much for that. And there was like, Jews don't sow, Jews don't plow, Jews don't fight, you know, all these anti-Semitic tropes. And finally, he, Jewish, like, proudly, you know, flying over. So, you know, and I think, okay, so finally he understood something about Israel.
I think we should probably open things up to questions. And if I was supposed to be keeping time, oh, looks like it's time.
Okay, can I ask you a question? Okay, you said that he felt so Jewish. That from my point of view, he never felt Jewish. And as an example, as you know, he lived and died. He Venice, and he specifically wanted to be buried at a Christian cemetery.
No, you
So
know what?
What Jew wants to be buried at Christian cemetery?
Yeah, you know what? I can't.
I can speak to the reality of that.
Actually
I
happened.
was actually going to ask.
Yeah, it's better. Yeah.
Brodsky's literary executor, a question, so I'm going to follow up.
He didn't have, it wasn't his request to be buried in Venice. He didn't have a specific request to be buried anywhere, and it was an issue, a question of where he would be buried, because the Russians wanted him to be returned to Russia. He had at one point said that he would like to be buried in his house in Massachusetts, but that was far away from all of the people who would like to see him. So then the city of Venice offered. It's quite unusual to be given an opportunity to be buried in Venice because there's not much space. So the city of Venice offered him a spot, and everybody felt like that would be a good solution. And there are only 3 cemeteries in Venice: the Catholic cemetery, which you get moved out of after a certain number of years, the Orthodox cemetery, and the Protestant cemetery. And the Orthodox cemetery seemed like not the one, so we went with the Protestant cemetery.
I'm just going to jump in with one question for Ann. As literary executor, part of your job is fact-checking.
Fact-checking. Absolutely.
And one of the things you said in our interview I didn't include is that people are always, doing biographical scavenger hunts, and it's now become your labor of love, I guess.
Well, I don't
To deal with
I don't actually see it as my job to correct people's misprisions. Joseph certainly, like many poets and writers, had a very strong resistance to reading his work biographically. I think
that's
many
what you
serious writers feel as though they have alchemically transformed whatever the basic matter of their experience is in turning it into the work, and that was certainly his strong position.
There are rumors that he was baptized, but he never was. And actually, when Naiman, his friend, was insisting on this, he said, "No, I'm not doing this." And he didn't like Pasternak for his conversion to Christianity. So this is not because he liked Jews or he didn't like someone else. This is because he was staying of who he was, his personality, how he was born and who he is was the most important for him. This is why I'm saying, actually, it's based on his own words about his Jewishness and about a lot of jokes. And he didn't want to be a part of Jewish world. He didn't want to perform at synagogues. It was like too much for him, So it was like,
But I love the way you said it was about who he was and where he was from, and I just think about that essay, A Room and a Half,
Absolutely.
where there's this human being emerging, and the articles and the smells and the everything of that room is who you become. That is the quotidian. Many questions, yes.
Thank you all very much. I understand that when he got to Vienna, he was met. I understand that when he got to Vienna, he was met by W.H. Auden. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about the influence of Auden and their relationship.
Of Ogden.
Or W.H. Auden, yeah.
Yeah, maybe not me, maybe. I can talk about the influence of Russian poets more.
He was actually met by his friend Karl Proffer, who brought him to Auden, knowing what a powerful affinity Joseph had for Auden. And his early translator, George Klein, had persuaded Auden to write an introduction to his first book of poems, and Joseph was tremendously honored by that. So this early visit to Auden is almost kind of mythic occasion that it's hard to believe they actually achieved in real life, that Joseph's first experience, real encounter with a poet. outside of Russia was to see Auden at his house in Austria in Kirchstetten. I think, I don't like to be too interpretive about Joseph's work. I'm not myself a scholar. I'm sort of around to sort of do the work, the kind of backstage work of keeping things going. But to speak to your point a little bit, I think some of the themes that came up in the show illustrate this. I think for me, the thing that powerfully attracted him to Auden's work was the stature of the anti-heroic posture. That Auden was a complete master of the form, but he always turned it away from turning himself into a romantic figure or an idol or a heroic figure. And Joseph was enchanted with this. I think he learned from that when he first read Auden when he was in internal exile in Russia, and that was sort of the beginning, or toward the beginning, of his sort of enamoredness with English. That the English poetic tradition gave him this kind of escape from these more heroic postures that came out of Russian Romanticism. And he felt that was, I think, to him, a vehicle, both a formal vehicle and a kind of personality vehicle into modern life, a way of being a poet of the mundane and quotidian and daily reality, and escaping these kind of falsified theatrical postures.
Yes.
Hey, thank you so much for the great movie. I really loved how deeply literary it was, and it was very interesting in comparison to many other biographies of Brodsky we already have as movies and books and whatnot. Thank you so much. It was very interesting. And my question is primarily for Professor Brent, Jonathan Brent. Speaking about Brodsky in translation and his English works, a lot of people say that his poetry in English is a bit weaker than what he produced in Russian, partially because probably he didn't understand the nature of Anglo-Saxon tradition of rhymes and poetry in general in some ways. And I've heard an opinion that in some ways his English poems are a little bit of what we can find in children's books here in the States. This is the opinion of literary critics, I've heard. So what do you think about it? Do you agree? And is it potentially a problem for the Western reader?
Very, very...
I hope you'll give me a crack at this one, Jonathan.
Excuse me? What's that?
I hope you'll give me a crack at this one.
Oh, I will. But very reluctantly, I do have to agree to a great extent with what you just said. In my view, I felt when he began writing in English, something left the poetry. And I think, to me, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, but for me, what left the poetry was the authentic relationship to the culture. In Russia, he knew where everything was. He knew the presumptions, the conventions, the idioms, the slang that worked 20 years ago and doesn't work today. In English, not being of that culture, all of that has to be learned. And so it introduces a different element. And I felt that when I read his poetry in English, and I'm not a scholar of Brodsky, really, but that's my impression.
May I ask, since I chose one of those poems that he wrote in English, and I think I chose it, its theme of the awkwardness of the Centaur and a certain clumsiness in the verse worked well.
I think that's an exception to what I'm saying.
Okay, that's what I was checking.
Absolutely, yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Oh, but could I please talk about this? Because this is really important to me.
Please do.
I actually wrote about it in my introduction to Joseph's selected poems in English, and I hope you might look that up if you're interested in this subject. I feel I was a participant in this transition into writing his own work in English, and I was always trying to bring him in, to sort of curb his wilder tendencies. But I also saw at very close range that there was no one translating into English literature who could reproduce the effects that he could achieve in Russian. And what he was trying to do in English did go against the grain and did drag against our contemporary traditions, but he felt that he was revitalizing the language and bringing to it something that we didn't have going on and giving us something fresh. And I agree. I think a lot of our resistance to it has to do with our inability to stretch our ideas of what poetry can do. There are many things that are awkward, that seem, many things I would have liked him to have improved on, but I feel like the strain and the effort of reading into these works is a invigorating one, and one that enlivens the language.
Can you just say a word or two about how you were involved in that process? Because it's a pretty fascinating.
Well, what he used to do was that he would have somebody who was not a poet write what he called an interlinear, a literary version. And then he liked to have that sent to a poet to work it into a poetic version that would rhyme, and it's not just that it would use rhyme and meter, but that it would use them in a way that was integral to the meaning and the velocity and the semantics of the poem. It's not just a matter of mechanically reproducing those effects. But then he would get this thing back, and it wasn't him. And he was always lessened, and humor is really a huge element of this problem, because most of these people would not, they were very earnest in their effort to reproduce his more kind of lofty effects, but would not get into this, the more nitty-gritty or the looser or the more demotic elements of the work. So the reason that he wanted to work on his poetry in English was that he wanted his friends, the people who were all around him, to experience his work as it really was, and not to be estranged from, he had students, he had colleagues, he had neighbors, and he didn't want to be removed from them by this bubble of language. So it's really a constant effort to be participating in the culture that he was in, and I feel like it's a gift to us, even if it's something that we encounter as a challenge or something a little too high to climb. I think he was a great enough writer that it's worth the effort.
Do you think, Anne, that there was the mediation there of another personality, another sensibility in that poet who translated it to begin with? Right? There is a...
That would usually get washed out by the time.
And how those people feel.
Angry. There's plenty of records.
Yeah. It's a very unusual process. Yes?
His Nobel Prize was for English poetry or for Russian?
It was for the full body of work.
Yeah.
They spoke about his essays in English as also being a significant contributor.
But that was, for me, that there was a Nobel Prize given to him as an American for a body of work written mostly in Russian is in itself and it says something about American poetry. It says that there can be an American poetry that isn't written in English.
And just for a footnote to that, that's now quite commonplace. There are now many younger American poets who were born in another language, who live in two countries. But when Joseph was doing it, it was just a truism that you could only write in your native language.
My question is, was it his Russian soul or his artistic sensibility that predominated his passion as a poet?
He was born. When he was on trial, when he was 23, you already know about this episode. The judge asked him why they actually accused him of being a social parasite, so he didn't work. He didn't go to work. Why do you decided that you're a poet? Who determined it? Did you learn something about the poetry? And he said, you know what, it's from God. It was his response. He didn't have, I believe, any other response. So it's from Russian culture or it's from God. So, and you know, and this is actually a tradition also in Russian poetry. The poet is like a prophet, you know, and his lips are, you know, it's like, it's actually from Bible, yeah? That God really, you know, speaks through the poet, yeah. And Akhmatova believes in this. So.
But you know, he wrote the essay To Please a Shadow.
Can I just make one correction? You're not talking about Jack, but he never was sent to jail. He was sent to mental institution.
I'm not saying about jail. He didn't send to mental institution as well. He was in exile. So he was sent to work in North village. And he was sent for 5 years, but he was for 1 year. And the episode was talking before, when he came back, so he was sent in 64, I believe, and he came in 65. So he wasn't in jail, thank God.
Another question? Yeah, back there.
A little bit of switch of topic, because I just heard about Marshal Zhukov, the poem that you mentioned. So the great theme that this is an epitaph. The second, this is a poem when Zhukov conquered other capitals, but was feared to come back to his own. And that was Stalin, that he feared. Even this hero marshal. By the way, in 1953, he personally shot Beria, Zhukov. And this is an epitaph to the epoch of Zhukov, Stalin, and the rest. And as for his other bitter and social work, like starting with his speech over spilled milk, and Shestvia, this is procession, and other satirical work, which are social and political, by the way. So there was another, except the theme and this relation with Maria Basmanova. Actually, there were a number of poems dedicated to this, after this triangular, so to speak, and finishing with a very bitter poem entitled Ithaca.
Sir, it is a little hard to hear you, so I'm so sorry. Is there a question that you have?
I considered that in the form and in other things, these two poems that were featured in the movie, great as they are, they're incompatible. They're dedicated to different spheres and to different things about human activity. One is about love, and the other is something else. And by the way, in my view, it was inspired, the second poem, in part by Auden. His monument to a non-citizen.
Yes, I think it was. I think that's right. I think let's just take one more question, and then we will, I think, conclude.
I wonder if you would talk a bit about Brodsky's influence and interest in Jewish American poetry. I know that in the 60s, he translated Chaim Plutzik's Horatio and presented it on stage in Moscow. So was he particularly interested in Plutzik or in other Jewish American poets?
I'm sorry, we all had trouble
I
hearing
couldn't hear
you.
you.
We all had trouble hearing you. Did somebody closer?
Jewish American, Chaim Plutzak.
Oh, thank you. And what was the question?
Translated Chaim Plutzak's poetry.
He talked about his relation to Jewish American poetry.
He did it in Russia.
It's not Plutzik?
Chaim Plutzak.
It might be Plutzik, do you think?
No,
It was Potok?
thought Chaim Potok was a novelist.
Do those translations exist? Are you aware of them, Ann?
I was aware that he had an enthusiasm for
Because if they
Plutzik.
do, that would be very special. I'd want them in the YIVO Institute archive.
I'm not aware of them, no.
All right, we're going to do just one more, and then we will call it a night. Thank you all.
What I really wonder about is how the censorship worked, in the sense that is a censor very intelligent and sensitive, or was the censor a brute with no sense at all of the literary merits of it? It seems that all too often some very bright people understood the metaphors and the rest of what Brodsky was doing, and that, of course, became the basis of his exile. And I thought it could be interesting to elaborate upon what that meant in terms of a censoring culture.
Brodsky was never published in the Soviet Union. We had all typewritten sheets, that we were sharing with each other. It was what we call samizdat, like, people, somebody really typed it, it's like many copies. So who censored him? There were, it's interesting situation actually, because there were like groups, groups of poets, like older, who were not so much teaching, but they were like, it was like a workshop, would say. Yeah, it was like a workshop of poetry. And there were like older people and younger people. And for example, when Brodsky read his Jewish cemetery, it was a huge scandal. Even these older people who were like heads of the studio, of this workshop, they were like mad because he did not announce it before. It's not only about the content of the poem, but that he just came out without really telling this group that what he will be reading. And of course, the only word Jewish cemetery, it sounded so bad in the Soviet Union that he was reported. But what is interesting that one of these workshop leaders was Natalia Grudinina, who was really scolded him, but after she was defending him at the trial. So, so this is how this censorship worked. He was he was a young artist, a young poet, and he did not have like a higher permission to be published. And Maramzin, maybe you know this guy, he was a poet and writer, and he was trying to make his like a volume, and he was arrested, really arrested, and he went finally to Paris. So it was, a lot of stuff.
Could I add something to that?
Yes.
The censorship was highly structured and happened on many levels. Essentially, however, and it also changed over time. His trial was 1964. And he was sent to a work camp. In 1937, he would have been shot. No questions asked. There was, in these totalitarian societies, there's a phenomenon that the historian Ian Kershaw, in writing about Hitler, Hitler's Germany, calls working toward the Führer. Working toward the Führer. And that happened in Nazi Germany, but it also happened to a great extent in the Soviet Union. Stalin once said to a subordinate, if I have to tell you to do something, it's already too late. And so the entire structure, at least of Stalinist society, which, of course, by 1963 had undergone a real transformation into post-Stalinist Soviet culture. But in Stalinist society, this working toward the Führer, toward the Vozhd in the case of Stalin, was a matter of understanding first principles. And the first principle was, do not violate the character and the nature and the directives of the party, whatever those directives might be, whether it's Germany is the enemy, or Germany is the friend, or America is the enemy, or America is the friend. Do not violate that. Anything that begins to violate that is then suspect, and you don't need to have a great mind to understand these things. However, in the case of, let us say, Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, which has been the subject of some considerable scholarship, it is well known that the Central Committee became aware of this novel, Dr. Zhivago, in 1958, and denounced it, but had never read it. And at a certain point, they then delegated the head of the cultural unit in the Central Committee, a man by the name of Dmitry Polikarpov, to actually read the novel. And he read the novel. And I can tell you, if any of my undergraduate students wrote a report on that novel that was half as brilliant as his critique of it, they would get a straight A. Polikarpov was no thug. These were people with actually intelligence and sensibility. But they were party members, and therefore they kept that in check. And they acted as the party demanded. And he concludes this long 8-page critique of Dr. Zhivago with a simple sentence: comrades, there are so many very interesting historical things about this novel, blah, 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 but unfortunately, this novel is our enemy, because at the center of it is the bourgeois ego, which we talk about.
Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.